One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey, there's Dr. Ann. Welcome back to the Inflammation Nation. And we're moving on today into the fifth pillar of hormone balance and control. And I think what I'll do is just give you a super quick rundown on what the first four were before we talk about the final one, which is inflammation. And just to give you some expectations, we have one episode left in this discussion where we'll talk about the link between hormones and neurotransmitters, which is an interesting conversation. So let's talk about the first four pillars. We started with insulin and blood sugar control, and we talked about reactive hypoglycemia and insulin resistance patterns, and in particular, the importance of controlling insulin being the main mechanism that starts to drive changes in hormonal balance in both men and women. Then we went on and talked about pillar number 2, which was stress chemistry or adrenal dysfunction. We talked a little bit about the hormone cascade and how all steroid-based hormones, including your reproductive hormones, as well as your stress hormone, cortisol, are all derived from a base molecule of cholesterol, and how they're all interlinked and different enzymes control conversion of one hormone to another. And these enzymes can either be upregulated or downregulated by stress, but also by other environmental factors. And we also talked about the pregnenolone steal, which is a phenomenon where the body will prioritize maintaining cortisol sufficiency, sometimes at the expense of hormonal production, specifically your reproductive hormones. And that just underlines the importance of having good adrenal status. Third pillar was gut health. We talked about inflammation in general as it relates to the gut. We talked about bacterial toxins like lipopolysaccharides. We talked a little bit about leaky gut, infections, upregulation of beta-glucuronidase, and how that has a tendency to uncouple hormones that were tagged for elimination so that they can recirculate in the body. And we talked a little bit about the microbiome. And we actually continued the discussion on the microbiome when we talked about the fourth pillar, which is our last episode, and that was detoxification capacity, because all the hormones that we produce or that we take get broken down and eliminated. And so when it comes to toxin or detoxification, there's two issues. Number one is, how are we handling our own hormonal load? And how do environmental compounds impact hormone physiology as well as detoxification? So we talked a little bit about how the liver and the microbiome have these phase 1 and phase 2 systems to take fat-soluble compounds, turn them into water-soluble compounds so that we can eliminate them. And that has to happen efficiently, and it happens minute by minute. And that brings us to the fifth and the final one. And I'm not sure how long this discussion will be, because the fifth pillar is your inflammatory load. And we've mentioned in episodes, we've kind of talked about it throughout this whole podcast series, actually, that in general, your inflammatory load has the potential to impair hormone production by changing the integration of hypothalamic and pituitary interactions. And it can also change how your receptors respond to the hormones themselves. And so it is entirely possible to have, for example, a progesterone resistance, just like you have insulin resistance, where you have too much progesterone and the receptors start malfunctioning or not working as efficiently, because this is a survival mechanism. It's a way to prevent overstimulation and function gone wild, if you will. So we know that inflammation basically interferes with hormone signaling from top to bottom. In women in particular, and this is just a couple of things that I share with doctors when we teach this stuff at the doctor level, or the healthcare provider level is probably a better way to say it, is that when you look at someone, let's say it's a woman of any, let's say in her reproductive years, and she has concerns about hormone balance and control, and maybe you don't even have the benefit of doing proper diagnostics at this point. If you have a woman with hormonal symptomatology and complaints, and they have premenstrual symptoms, particularly those that include pain, whether that's breast pain or pelvic pain, quite often they happen together, then we know that inflammation is part of that hormonal problem. It may not be the only one, but anytime we have that PMS picture of pain the week or 10 days prior to the cycle, maybe even the first few days of the cycle, we know that inflammation is a key player, not just a player, but a key player. And at that point, it becomes important to be able to suss out where the inflammation is coming from and what you can do about that. And I'll come back to that in just a second. And that's the simple rubric, if you will, for trying to figure out whether inflammation is part of female hormone imbalance for guys, as well as women. But obviously, men are not going to have PMS type symptoms. But for guys, they'll typically have hormone like andropausal type complaints, and quite often they'll complain of things like joint and muscle pain. And so if I have a guy, pardon me, who feels like he's, not at the top of his game, he's fatigued, he's just not motivated, he just doesn't feel that vim and vigor that he used to feel when he was younger, and he says, oh, by the way, my back hurts all the time, and maybe he goes to the chiropractor, the acupuncturist, and gives temporary relief, then typically we know that inflammation is a key player. And as I said a moment ago, the main thing from a clinical perspective, as well as in terms of kind of delivering outcomes, is to make sure you can figure out where the inflammation is coming from. Now, it's very tempting, even if the conversation is just constrained to hormones and inflammation. Anytime inflammation is mentioned, one of the first things that both healthcare practitioners and healthcare consumers want to know is, well, what supplement can I take for that? And so we have all kinds of research about natural compounds that have anti-inflammatory capacity, whether that is turmeric or resveratrol or boswellia or fish oil. And to be honest, the list is at this point getting too long to really kind of memorize. But I will say generally that things like turmeric, resveratrol, boswellia, and fish oil probably have the most amount of research behind them, but many other natural compounds exhibit some form of anti-inflammatory control. And most of them work on just a few mechanisms. Probably the most common one that is discussed in literature is the direct inhibition of something called NF-kappa B. And that's just 4 letters together, NF-kappa B. It stands for nuclear factor kappa beta. Let me come back to that. Let me finish the thought on the different mechanisms. But what I was saying is that these natural compounds tend to work on just a few mechanisms. One is the direct inhibition of this guy called NF-kappa B, and the other one is the increased production of either anti-inflammatory prostaglandins or maybe the production of what we call proresolvins or other some type of anti-inflammatory mediator. And this is one of the putative effects of fish oil, for example. Let's talk about NF-kappa B just for a moment. I believe I did a podcast on this very early when I first launched the Inflammation Nation. It might have been episode number 2 or 3 where we talked about, well, what is inflammation? And one of the key points that I made there is that inflammation is just a general term that we use to talk about the impact of certain types of immune chemicals, typically referred to as cytokines. There are chemokines and inflammatory prostaglandins, there's eicosanoids, but generally when we say inflammation, we might use the word cytokines. And what an NF-kappa B is it's, to use kind of scientific terminology, it is the final common pathway for inflammatory triggers. So if you think that pretty much everything about life is trying to inflame you, whether it's the environment, your diet, your stressors, we'll talk about a list again coming up in just a little bit. If we boil it all down to its essence, what all of these inflammatory triggers do is they encourage this thing called nuclear factor kappa beta to go from the interior of the cell called the cytoplasm into the nucleus. And the nucleus basically floats around inside the cytoplasm. Think of a sack within a sack, if you will. And if NF-kappa B gets into the nucleus, it can bind to your DNA, where it activates the transcriptional code that tells the cell how to make these inflammatory chemicals. And so if you are successful in activating NF-kappa B, and that is successful in turning on the DNA that controls the code for inflammation, then you become inflamed, or maybe you become more inflamed than you already were, because inflammation is at some level just a normal part of human physiology and life. It's about whether or not we can control that. And if we're successful in inhibiting NF-kappa B, what we're doing actually is inhibiting its ability to get into your nucleus to bind to your DNA. And actually we are using strategies like turmeric or resveratrol, for example, as direct NF-kappa B inhibitors to inhibit inflammation, not by removing the trigger source, whether that is an infection or an environmental chemical or like an unhappy or even potentially dangerous external circumstance. We're not removing triggers when we use things like turmeric and resveratrol. What we're doing is we're inhibiting the ability of NF-kappa B to activate and do its job. And that's almost a genetic approach or a transcriptional approach. And it's very important to understand the difference and very important to understand whether the context of is hormones or something else that's inflammatory based. It's very important to know, number one, that chronic inflammation underlies all chronic health problems. We have known that for a long time. But knowing you're inflamed is not enough, and knowing that you might be able to tone that down by using turmeric, resveratrol, boswellia, and so on, that also is not enough, even though it's quite often a very smart and a very good idea, because inflammation tends to beget more inflammation. Again, I'll come back to that. The most important thing is to remember that when you use anti-inflammatory compounds, natural compounds, or let's say even over-the-counter or prescription pharmaceuticals, you're not changing the mechanism. That's the most important thing. You have to figure out what the trigger is. What's the mechanism? Where's the inflammation coming from? And ultimately, how do we change that? Now, in a kind of a quirk of design, if you will, we know now that because inflammation tends to promote itself, so when we activate NF-kappa B, the production of inflammation actually creates more activation of NF-kappa B. And so we quite often talk about a self-perpetuating cycle of inflammation. Let's say that you have some kind of environmental trigger. Let's call it a parasite. Some parasite comes into your body, it activates NF-kappa B, you get inflamed, the inflammation promotes more inflammation. Well, maybe you do a parasite cleanse, or by some, stroke of luck, it just goes away on its own. You can actually still be inflamed, even though the original inciting trigger is gone. And this is part of the self-amplifying loop, is that you don't necessarily have to have a trigger anymore. And this is, contributes to what can often be puzzling clinical presentations where somebody comes in and they're obviously inflamed. You have the symptoms, you have maybe some laboratory evidence, but no matter how hard you look, you can't find the original trigger because sometimes it's just gone. And we see this quite often with autoimmunities that have run amok, if you will, people who have been unwell for years, if not decades, and their bodies just learn to be really, really good at being inflamed, even though they may have resolved the original trigger. And this is quite honestly where things like turmeric, resveratrol, boswellia tend to shine. And so just to bring this back into context, we're talking about inflammation as a promoter of hormone imbalance or dysregulation or complaints, and using female hormone physiology as our flagship clinical picture. If we have a woman with PMS that includes things like breast pain or pelvic pain and tenderness, we know inflammation is part of that picture. And it may be the only driver, it may be one of many different drivers, but just simply throwing anti-inflammatory drugs or chemicals or natural compounds is not sufficient. You have to do your due diligence to figure out where the problem is coming from. The danger of just simply using some kind of an anti-inflammatory strategy without trying to find and remove or control the original trigger is that eventually that trigger will win out. And you're just going to end up right back where you were before. And because inflammation affects all physiological systems, maybe you're dealing later down the road, not just with hormonal complaints, but with other issues as well. And so it's always, always, always the right clinical thing to investigate the trigger, the root cause, however you want to talk about that, and do that in conjunction with some kind of anti-inflammatory strategy. So it's all about, again, looking at root causes. There are several different things. I mentioned earlier that everything about life is pro-inflammatory, and that's actually true. Inflammation at some baseline level is necessary to engage longevity systems, to drive the production of things like antioxidants. And so without inflammation, we would actually, I don't know that we would die, but we wouldn't be healthy because we would not have baseline stress capacity or stress handling capacity and so on. But there are things that are particularly adept or good at driving NF-kappa B activation and causing these inflammatory cascades that over time and with more complexity tend to be self-perpetuating. And that would be, and we can broadly break those down into like external environmental inflammatory triggers versus internal, and then diet and lifestyle and so on. And so I'm going to run down a brief list, and we've dealt with some of these already with their own mini-series, but it's worthwhile just repeating because, as with anything related to human health and disease, it can become so complex that you see these lists or you listen to podcasts like this and you just start forgetting details because there's too much to manage and you want more information rather than pausing and developing depth and detail of things that you might already know. So it's just good as a reminder to go back and talk about these different lists. So for example, with external environmental triggers, chemical toxins. We talked about toxins just in our last episode with detoxification, but this is the real deal. We talked about endocrine disrupting chemicals and we talked about obesogens, but all of these chemicals, whether they're classed as hormone disruptors or not, they all drive inflammation. Pardon me. And they also tend to deplete us of our key antioxidant stores, which are not only kind of cofactors used in detoxification, but they're also part of how we maintain our barrier system, which is part of how we maintain immunological control. And so if we have, for example, some kind of a toxic burden that might be disrupting our hormones directly, we see depletion of our glutathione status and antioxidant capacity, we get a leaky gut or a leaky brain. And all of these things actually promote more inflammation, which places more demand on the systems that are already taxed. And so it is not uncommon in trying to figure out somebody's hormonal complaints and why they're suffering. It's not uncommon to do something like a urinary toxin screen to look at heavy metals or to look at environmental chemicals of different kinds and even mycotoxins, which might be related to things like black mold or sick building, wet building syndrome, or certainly can be related to mycotoxins or mold toxins that are commonly found in foods. Also, in the external environment, we could continue or consider diet to be part of that, just simply because food comes from the outside. We could probably also place it into the internal environment because obviously once you put food inside your system, it has to be digested, absorbed, assimilated, and also has great potential to drive inflammation from the gut out into the body. And so diet can be a big problem. And it could be a problem driving inflammation either because you're eating foods you're reacting to, or maybe it's because you're sourcing things that are full of toxins. And this is another aspect of environmental triggers and inflammation that's really not commonly talked about. There's a big push and has been for a couple of decades now for people to go organic, to buy organic fruits and vegetables. And I'll tell you right now that organic, the label organic, assuming that it's even a valid label, as there is a lot of fraudulent claims that are out there, but even organic fruits and vegetables don't have a zero toxin load. They just have less. And depending on what your detox capacity is, depending on what your sensitivity level is, you may actually be driving more inflammation by going organic. Now, just a quick tip. There's a group called the Environmental Working Group, and EWG.org. Their website is EWG.org. And every year they publish what they call the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen list. And these are fruits and vegetables that tend to not gather and contain as many toxins in endocrine disrupting chemicals as others. And these are things that you can probably source from your regular grocery store rather than worrying about, going to Whole Foods or some local health food store and paying a little extra money for that. And so you can kind of, look at those lists. Again, it's the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen. You can easily find these on the internet. And that might help you make some decisions in terms of how you're spending your grocery dollars and trying to reduce your chemical load and your chemical burden. All right, let's talk about internal environment and metabolic imbalances. If you've been following the podcast here on the Inflammation Nation for the last several months, we've touched on several of these, and some of these will be topics for future mini-series within the podcast. But understand that anything that shifts internally in your normal metabolic state not only tends to be complicated by inflammation, can actually drive inflammation in and of itself. So for example, if you do have a blood sugar issue, let's say you're a functional or reactive hypoglycemic and your blood sugar drops and you get shaky, you get irritable, you get lightheaded, and then you eat and you feel better again. there's an inflammatory component to that. And so your blood sugar pattern itself, you might think you're doing everything you can to not eat foods that you're reacting to eat clean, organic, low toxin type foods. You've done your detoxes and you're taking turmeric or resveratrol, and all along you're really not paying attention to blood sugar balance and control, or what's happening, for example, with your insulin. Is it spiking? Is it chronically elevated? Those things by themselves drive inflammation, which then can complicate your hormonal picture, as well as do a whole host of and myriad of other things, just because that's what inflammation does. We have talked again about how having gut infections or having some kind of imbalance or dysbiosis, having leaky gut, all of these drive inflammation. And as it relates to gut inflammation, it doesn't stay in the gut. Just as a reminder, we talked about this again a couple of episodes. And so it doesn't matter if it's things like blood sugar or gut-related things or thyroid imbalances, or a history of head injury, or maybe some state of neurodegeneration. And the list goes on and on and on. Any internal metabolic imbalance increases your inflammatory state, period. That's just the way physiology is. And this is one of the reasons why inflammation is involved in all chronic health and disease, is because it's both a cause and a result of metabolic disturbance. And once we initiate the inflammatory cascade, it promotes itself, even though you might at some point resolve whatever the primary trigger that started the whole thing off to begin with. And then we have things like lifestyle factors. We have multiple studies that show that just one night of poor sleep creates a pro-inflammatory environment for something like 18 to 20 hours the next day. Some studies even go beyond that into the second day. We know that your exercise habits, either not exercising or exercising too much and getting into your overreaching type syndromes, can drive inflammation. And so, sometimes with exercise, it's a little bit of it's a razor's edge. And you might want to go back and listen to the podcast that I did on the metabolic tipping point, or the relationship between exercise and inflammation. It's actually been one of the more popular series of episodes that we've done here on the podcast. And then there are things like stress reduction strategies. I mean, obviously, if adrenal status and stress have an inflammatory component, then whether or not you're handling your stress properly, and are you doing an honest inventory of your life and all of your obligations? Do you know how to say no to things that you don't necessarily need to be responsible for? Believe it or not, and I mentioned this before again, that even your thoughts and your emotions can drive inflammatory cascades. And this is fairly well documented in the world of psychoneuroimmunology, where negative thinking, pessimism, all of these things tend to drive inflammation. Now, again, there's a bidirectional relationship where you can have all these things be the result of inflammation. But once you get into that loop, it almost becomes the chicken and the egg question. It doesn't really matter what started first. And sometimes you don't necessarily need to know. You need to know that you need to fix both of them. You need to work on your mindset, your thought process, actively choosing to see the positive in things and people. And obviously that takes a while to reprogram your thought process, but also doing things to reduce the inflammation that could be coming from and causing those things. And so in summary now, before we close out this episode and think a little bit about going on to the next one where we talk about neurotransmitters, when you deal with hormonal imbalances and complaints, it's no joke. I mean, people can really suffer and have a degradation of their quality of life. Obviously, it's like any other metabolic issue. You can have a mild hormonal imbalance, or you can have a really massive major one that goes beyond just simply, having hot flashes and that kind of stuff. I mean, it can really change your quality of life to the point where, there's nothing other than you can only focus on one thing, and that's how bad you feel. But one of the things I wanted to point out in this particular series on hormones and health is, on one hand, how simple it is and how complicated it can be. Because it is very simple to say there are 5 pillars of hormone balance and control, and really the best approach before you jump into things like hormone replacement is to go ahead and assess yourself, or have someone assess you on where you stand with each of these different pillars or priorities, and then start working to change that and have an expectation, a hopeful expectation that your hormone balance and control is going to improve as a result. And if it doesn't, then you know that you probably have an absolute need for hormone replacement therapy. And so on one hand, it's very simple because we can break down the foundation of hormone balance and control into 5 measurable things that we can change. On the other hand, pick any one of those 5 pillars and they expand out into multiple subsystems. And so it's one thing to say, hey, I've got a blood sugar problem. Maybe that's what's driving my hormone imbalance. Then we have to figure out, is it low blood sugar or high blood sugar? What's going on with insulin, the ratio of insulin and glucagon? How does your diet and your lifestyle factor into that? And we can play that game with each of the different priorities. And so, like I said, on one hand, it's fairly easy. On the other hand, it's more complicated. All right, so we're going to close it out there. And in the next episode, we're going to dive into talking about hormones and neurotransmitters and talk about how they are, we can group hormones and neurotransmitters into functional pairs. It's a set of relationships that most practitioners are not aware of. I'll guess that this might be the first time that you've heard it. So stay tuned, come back, and we'll see you next time on the Inflammation Nation. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.